Back here on One, New York's longest-running sports call-in show. Pleasure to be joined by John Helmkamp. He is a staff writer at Deadspin, co-host of the Red Shirts Fantasy Football Podcast. You can find him on Twitter at DynastyBeard. John, how are you today? Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
So we want to start off, ton of news to get to here. I want to start off in the NBA and the reaction to James Harden and the trade that makes him a Brooklyn Net. When you see that news go down, what is your initial thought and what's the reaction there?
Yeah, I mean, it was a massive trade and it just kind of came out in stages over the course of like 5-10 minutes, right? So you had the initial trade that showed that he was going to the Nets, you know, in exchange for Karis LeVert and some picks, and then you start getting all the details of it. And then like 5 minutes later, you find out that Houston flipped Karis LeVert to Indiana in exchange for Victor Oladipo. So it was a massive, massive shift. It's probably one of the biggest, like, compensation-wise trades that we've seen. I mean, you had 4 unprotected firsts and 3 players, and then 4 first-round swaps between the 2 teams in exchange for just James Harden. So I think that it's going to be a very, very interesting dynamic that they're going to have to figure out there between 3 big alpha personalities, you know, that tend to have a lot of off the court stuff going on around them at all times. It's going to be interesting to see if they can blend it all together. I think that it's one of 2 things. It either goes incredibly well and we see them in the NBA finals, or it's an absolute train wreck. And it's going to be really fascinating to see how they blend that all together.
So, John, you talked about that there at the end. The expectations, obviously, for the Brooklyn Nets right now are extremely high. What are your realistic expectations for this team after the Harden trade?
Well, I think one of the things that they have going for them is that Harden and Kevin Durant played together at Oklahoma City. So you have some built-in chemistry there already, which is going to help things. Now, whatever's going on off the court, with Kyrie Irving, you know, and he got a big fine handed to him today for going to a party. So if they can get him back in the building and focused on basketball now that they have Harden there, I think that the built-in chemistry between Kevin Durant and James Harden is going to be really, really helpful to them being able to piece it together, because you're right. They are all in on this being a championship roster. They've sunk so much capital into these 3 players. The expectation is championship ring or bust. And them being in the Eastern Conference, I think they've got a chance at making a good run at it. And in the fact that this is early in the season that this trade happened, they're going to have some time to kind of iron out the wrinkles and get everything how they want it to be. The Eastern Conference is going to be really easy for them to make the playoffs, right? It's not that hard to accomplish. So I think for them, it's just going to be getting everything ironed out, get into the playoffs, give yourself a chance to get in, and then make a run at it and see what happens. So I think that they're going to be interesting to watch. And they should, you know, come springtime, April or so, probably be clicking pretty well and be a dangerous team.
John, perhaps it's impossible to know because it seems to be something that everyone is trying to figure out recently, but how do you think this affects Kyrie Irving and his mentality about everything that has been going on with him in Brooklyn? And also another member of this organization, Steve Nash, is a first-time head coach. How do you think that this deal affects those 2?
I think it's a huge test for Steve Nash as a coach, because he's never been a coach and he was never a big vibrato guy when he was playing. You know what I mean? He was like the quiet leader on the court. So I think this is going to be a really big test in terms of, can you get these 3 personalities to focus on basketball instead of all the off the court issues? James Harden is not exactly in the best shape of his life right now. He's going to have to work back into some playing shape. And you've got Kyrie Irving, who's just kind of floating adrift away from the team, popping into political Zoom calls just all over the place. It's like, dude, get back with the team, get on the court, let's focus on basketball, and let's try to make a run at it. And I think that them bringing in Harden, I think, shows Kyrie Irving that this organization is all in on making a championship roster. And I think that that is going to start shifting his attention back to basketball. Again, it's going to be really interesting to watch. It could be absolutely amazing, or it could just be a beautiful disaster that takes place for the Nets. It's going to be one or the other.
So obviously after this trade, there is certainly a lot of people that brought up some of the big issues surrounding trading for James Harden. I want to bring up two, and I want to think, which one do you think is a bigger issue, whether it be defense, who obviously lost Jared Allen and gained a poor defender in James Harden, or is it going to be the team chemistry like you talked about, which will play a huge role with Harden coming to this team?
Well, I think that the defensive casualty is pretty dramatic. Now, Mike D'Antoni is also on this staff, and if there's anything that he's shown us in the past when working with Harden, is that he doesn't really care about defense if you can outscore the other team. That's like his whole philosophy on everything, is just shoot the ball. And I think that that's how they're building this team. It's going to just be an offensive, onslaught by the time everyone's clicking on all cylinders. And that's going to be their philosophy. We saw the Lakers when they were on their way to their championship in the bubble over the summer. Their defense was killing it. Their defense was playing incredibly good. They were closing out on the perimeter. They were limiting the big plays, the threes, things like that. So if we're looking way too far out in advance, further than we should, and if it's going to be those two teams that could potentially be meeting for the NBA Finals, you're going to have two very polar opposite philosophies that are going to be, trying to win out. It's going to be, our strength is it better than your strength? And that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. So I think that losing the defense is probably less than ideal, but when you have three guys on your roster that can give you a triple-double on any given night, I think that that's the way that they wanted to go about this.
Talking to John Helmkamp, staff writer at Deadspin, co-host of the Red Shirts Fantasy Football Podcast. John, I want to switch over to the NFL. The Jets make it official, or at least in principle, they're going to hire the 49ers defensive coordinator, Robert Sala. What is your impression of the hiring of Sala, and why is he the right guy for the Jets right now?
Yeah, I love Robert Sala. He's been great. And as a Seahawks fan, I'm happy to see him leave my division. The dude just knows football. He's a hard worker, and he's a high energy guy. And I think that with this organization, coming out of the Adam Gase era, which was just awful, there was no connection between Adam Gase and his players that was, physically palpable to the outside. I think that bringing in Robert Sala, you're bringing in someone that's going to bring in the energy, the work ethic, the desire to connect, with his players, be a player's coach, and do good things from a culture standpoint. And when you're as far away as the Jets are, because they're far right now, that's what it needs to start with. You need to start with that vision, with that philosophy, with the culture, the tone of the team, and then start building from there. So I think that Sala is going to do a great job in that aspect. And then he's a very, very good defensive-minded coach as well. So as they're looking ahead and they're looking at draft capital that they have available to them, and they're looking at things like that, I think that the GM would be wise to allow him to have a lot of say in the kind of players that he wants to come into this team and who they want to bring in to fit, the culture and the system that he's going to put in place. I think it's a great hire. I think it's a slam dunk. I think that this is a much better hire for them than someone that's just supposed to be the next offensive whiz kid. Let's go the opposite direction. We tried the offensive whiz kid with Adam Gase, the quarterback whisperer, when he was down there in Miami, which is hilarious because Tannehill's killed it ever since leaving him. Go the opposite direction. Get a culture guy, a hard work guy, kind of a quote unquote just football guy. You know what I mean? That old school kind of approach to football. I think it's going to fit their organization really well.
Speaking on Robert Sala, what do you expect him to do with the whole Sam Darnold situation and the NFL draft? Do you think he should keep Sam Darnold and look to draft someone else, or what do you think about that?
I think that when you're looking to build a roster, one of the things that is going to give that roster the most flexibility going forward is a cheap quarterback contract. Sam Darnold's already been in the league for a few years. They're coming up on the point where they're going to need to make a decision and either extend him or move on. I think that being able to kind of press the reset button and go quarterback at 2, and lock in a very good quarterback prospect. It could be Justin Fields. If Trevor Lawrence somehow inexplicably is there at 2 instead of going at 1, presumably to Jacksonville, then you just run that to the podium. I think going that route and giving yourself that contract flexibility, that cap room flexibility for the next 4 years under that rookie contract is going to help them rebuild this roster more than sticking with Sam Darnold and having to pay him coming up here shortly. So I think it could be a situation where we see Sam Darnold get traded to someone that has cap space and might think that they can unlock him, like the Colts, for instance, who have an aging out quarterback situation, good cap room, good offensive line, good defense. Something like that could be an interesting fit. So I would expect that they're going to go quarterback, but Robert Sala being the defensive-minded guy, you know, he might look to that side of the ball or trade down and try to get more capital to continue to turn over this roster.
You mentioned Trevor Lawrence, and as it stands right now, it seems as though he will be on his way to Jacksonville, who just hired their new head coach, one of 2 vacancies to be filled thus far in the NFL. That man will be Urban Meyer, the ultra-successful college football coach at University of Florida to Ohio State, has been out of the game the last couple of years working on Fox. What did you think of Urban Meyer making the transition to the NFL? There's a lot of skepticism from a lot of people around the league saying, yeah, I'm not so sure this is going to work. What do you think?
I'm not so sure it's going to work either. I think there's a very big difference between college coaching and NFL coaching. We've seen it, you know, work some in the past. We've seen Pete Carroll be able to kind of bring, you know, his view and his energy and his connection to the players and translate that to the NFL level. But we've also seen a lot of very successful college coaches not know how to manage, you know, grown men that are getting paid to do this, as opposed to college kids that are, you know, they're on scholarship and looking to make their way to the NFL. So it's going to be interesting. One of the things that I do think he's got to his advantage is that Jacksonville doesn't really have any superstars to contend with right now in terms of like a butting head situation. He's going to be building it. So I think that works to his advantage. They've got a lot of cap space. They've got a lot of draft picks. They've got the number 1 overall pick. They have a real opportunity to make a pretty quick turnaround here, similar to what we saw in Miami. You know, Miami didn't make it into the playoffs this year, but they went from being a bottom team to on the cusp of a wild card berth. Jacksonville has the capability of potentially doing that next year in, you know, not the strongest division in football, a good division with the Titans and the Colts, but they should be able to invest pretty heavily on the defensive side of the ball in free agency, be able to get a quarterback of the future with the number 1 overall pick, roll with James Robinson at running back for another season, and, you know, start piecing things together to be going in the right direction. So the Urban Meyer hire is very interesting. I am skeptical if it's going to translate to the NFL. But the guy clearly does know football. And if he can manage the players correctly, I think that he's got a chance at putting together something kind of cool in Jacksonville.
Staying in the NFL, but switching here a little bit to the NFL playoffs coming up, obviously this weekend, the divisional round. Tom Brady and Drew Brees are going to square off in a big matchup. Which quarterback do you think has more pressure on them to win that game?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I'm going to say the pressure's on Tom Brady, because I think that with him leaving New England and deciding to go somewhere else, like, it's Super Bowl or bust for Tom Brady. Anything short of another ring, people are going to start throwing around the questions. You know, was he a system guy? Was it just because of he and Bill Belichick up in New England? You're going to start raising those questions, which are dumb questions. The dude has more Super Bowl rings than anybody. But I think that everyone is looking at him to win this, while people are looking at the Saints and more just saying, yeah, they've got a chance at it. They've been close for the last few years. They haven't quite gotten over the hump, and it would be a really nice story for Drew Brees to go get another ring and go out on top like Peyton Manning did. But I think in terms of pressure, I think that Brady's under the pressure of this game the most, where like he has to perform well and show that Father Time's not catching up to him. He needs to win this game. The Saints beat him twice already this year. And he needs to prove that he can win outside of New England. At least I think that's the chip on his shoulder. That's what's in his mind, I think. To continue to cement that legacy as the greatest of all time, go win somewhere else.
Talking to John Helmkamp, staff writer at Deadspin, co-host of the Red Shirts Fantasy Football Podcast. John, I'll get you out of here on this one. We talked about the elder statesmen in the NFC, young quarterbacks in the AFC, with all four of them being drafted as recently from 2017. What are your impressions of what's going on in the AFC, and who do you like this weekend?
Man, the AFC's fun. You're right. You've got all these young quarterbacks that are taking over the AFC side of the ball. Like the average age of the starting quarterbacks this weekend is like 24, 25 in the AFC. And in the NFC, it's like 37, and the Rams bring down the average. It's pretty crazy. The AFC is really fun. A lot of youth, a lot of excitement, coming on that side. I think while it's been a good story for the Browns, I think their road ends here with Kansas City. I think that's probably one of the easier games to pick this weekend. On the other side of it, I'm going to go Ravens over Bills. I don't think we've seen the Bills be able to slow down the run enough. I think that could be critical in that game. The Ravens are just humming right now. They look like they can hang 200 rushing yards on anyone at any time. In the NFC, I'm going to go with the Rams over the Packers. I think that the defensive front is going to be a problem. I think that Jalen Ramsey is going to be a problem. If he can slow down Devontae Adams and keep him to just at least an average game, I think they've got a chance at pulling off that upset. And then I am going to go Buccaneers over Saints as well, just because Tom Brady's never lost 3 times in a season to one team, and I think that they find a way to get that one done.
There you go. There are your picks for the divisional round this weekend. John Helmkamp, staff writer at Deadspin, co-host of the Red Shirts Fantasy Football Podcast. You can find him on Twitter at DynastyBeard. John, thanks so much for your time. Have a good one.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We'll be back with more one-on-one right after this.